It was a meeting no one saw coming. Pope Francis, the spiritual leader of over 1 billion Catholics worldwide, extended an unprecedented invitation to Vladimir Putin, the powerful president of Russia. The world held its breath as these two giants from vastly different worlds prepared to meet in the heart of Vatican City. What would they talk about? Could they find common ground? Or was this just another political maneuver? The date was set. Cameras rolled. Reporters buzzed with anticipation outside the grand walls of the Vatican. Inside, tension filled the air like an unspoken storm. As the doors of the Apostolic Palace opened, all eyes turned to the man who walked through them, a towering figure dressed in black, flanked by his security detail. It was him. Vladimir Putin had arrived. Pope Francis greeted him with a warm smile and open arms, but there was something deeper in his gaze. This wasn't just a courtesy call. It was a moment destined to change history. Little did anyone know, what unfolded behind those closed doors would leave the entire globe stunned. As the meeting began, both men sat across from each other, their faces calm but their minds racing. One represented faith, compassion, and unity. The other stood for power, authority, and national pride. And then the conversation took a turn no one could have predicted. The room was silent except for the soft ticking of a clock on the wall. Pope Francis leaned forward slightly, his hands resting gently on the table. His voice carried a tone of sincerity that seemed to fill the entire chamber. "Mr. President," he began, "we live in a time when divisions run deep. Wars rage across continents, families are torn apart, and hope feels distant for many. I believe we share a responsibility to bring peace, not only to our nations but to the world." Vladimir Putin's expression didn't change much. He sat back in his chair, studying the Pope with sharp eyes. After a pause, he responded, his voice measured yet firm. "Your Holiness, peace is indeed a noble goal, but sometimes peace requires strength. A nation without borders, without security, cannot survive. And survival must come first." Pope Francis nodded slowly, as if acknowledging the weight of Putin's words. "Strength is important," he agreed. "But true strength lies not in weapons or walls, but in understanding and dialogue. Have you ever considered what it means to truly listen?" At this, Putin raised an eyebrow, leaning forward just a fraction. "Listening is one thing, Your Holiness. Acting on what you hear is another. Tell me, how do you propose we handle those who refuse to play by the rules? Those who seek only chaos and destruction?" The Pope's response came swiftly, his words carrying a quiet authority. "By showing them a better way. By proving that love and mercy can conquer even the hardest hearts. Fear breeds violence, Mr. President. Love fosters unity." For a moment, the air between them crackled with tension. Then, unexpectedly, Putin let out a low chuckle. "Love and mercy," he repeated, shaking his head slightly. "Such ideals sound beautiful in theory, Your Holiness. But in practice, they often fall short against reality." This comment sparked a fire within the Pope. Gone was the gentle demeanor. Now his voice carried a passion that echoed through the room. "Reality is shaped by choices, Mr. President. Every decision we make ripples outward, affecting countless lives. If we choose fear, we create enemies. If we choose love, we build bridges. Which legacy do you wish to leave behind?" Putin stared at him, unblinking. For several long seconds neither man spoke. The silence stretched until finally, the Russian leader broke it with a question that sent shivers down the spines of everyone present. "And what happens?" he asked, his voice dripping with challenge. "When love fails, when mercy goes unanswered, what then, Your Holiness?" Before the Pope could reply, the door creaked open and a cardinal entered, whispering something urgently into the Pope's ear. Whatever the message contained, it clearly startled him. His eyes widened briefly before returning to their usual calmness. "Excuse me for a moment," he said softly, rising from his seat. As he stepped aside, the atmosphere shifted. Now, all attention turned to Putin, whose piercing gaze scanned the room like a predator sizing up its prey. What happened next would shock the world and change everything. As Pope Francis stepped away, Vladimir Putin sat alone at the table for a brief moment. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the distant hum of activity outside the Grand Palace. His fingers drummed lightly against the polished wood, betraying a hint of unease beneath his composed exterior. When the Pope returned moments later, his face bore a look of solemn determination. He retook his seat and locked eyes with Putin once more. "Mr. President," he began, his voice steady but tinged with urgency, "there is something you should know. While we speak here today, conflict continues to escalate in regions where innocent lives hang in the balance." Putin's jaw tightened. "Conflict," he echoed, his tone sharp. "You speak of conflicts as if they exist in a vacuum, Your Holiness. These are not mere disputes over land or resources. They are battles fought to protect sovereignty, to safeguard our people from threats both seen and unseen." The Pope leaned forward again, undeterred by the rising tension. "Sovereignty is important," he acknowledged. "But at what cost? At what point does protecting your borders mean sacrificing humanity itself? Every child caught in the crossfire, every family forced to flee their home, these are casualties of decisions made far away from the front lines." A muscle twitched in Putin's cheek. "Your Holiness, I respect your ideals, truly I do, but you live in a world of faith and hope. I live in a world of pragmatism and necessity. Sometimes, difficult choices must be made, for the greater good." "And who defines the greater good?" the Pope countered, his voice rising slightly. "Is it those in power, deciding the fate of others, without ever feeling the weight of their own losses? Or is it the collective voice of humanity, crying out for justice and compassion?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. For a moment, Putin hesitated. Then, with a slow nod he replied, "Perhaps you misunderstand my position. I am not blind to suffering, but I am also aware that weakness invites aggression. If we show too much mercy, others will exploit it." Pope Francis shook his head firmly. "Mercy is not weakness, Mr. President. It is courage. Courage to believe in the potential for change, even in the darkest hearts. Courage to stand firm in the face of adversity, not through force, but through example." Their exchange grew heated now, voices rising as each man defended his beliefs with unwavering conviction. Outside the room, reporters speculated wildly about what might be happening inside. Rumors spread like wildfire. Were they negotiating a peace deal? Was this a clash of ideologies? Back in the chamber, the debate reached its peak. Putin slammed his fist on the table, startling everyone present. "Enough," he exclaimed, his voice thunderous. "You ask me to abandon everything I have built to trust in ideals that may never come to fruition. How can I justify such risks to my people?" The Pope met his gaze squarely, unflinching. "Because," he said simply, "the alternative is far worse. A world divided by fear and hatred is no world at all, and if we fail to act, history will judge us harshly." For a long moment, the two men stared at each other, neither backing down. Then slowly, Putin exhaled, his shoulders relaxing just a fraction. "You are a remarkable man, Your Holiness," he admitted grudgingly. "Few would dare challenge me so directly, and fewer still would leave me questioning my own beliefs." The Pope smiled faintly. "That, Mr. President, is the power of dialogue, not to convince, but to understand. Perhaps together, we can begin to heal some of the wounds that divide us." As the meeting concluded, the world watched anxiously, waiting for news of what had transpired within those hallowed walls. What they didn't realize was that this was only the beginning. The meeting ended with a handshake that seemed to last an eternity. Pope Francis and Vladimir Putin stood face to face, their expressions unreadable, as they exchanged a few final words before parting ways. The cameras outside the Vatican captured every detail, zooming in on the subtle nuances of body language, Putin's firm grip, the Pope's gentle smile. But behind the scenes, something extraordinary had happened. During their heated debate, Pope Francis had shared a revelation that left Putin stunned. It wasn't about politics or religion, it was personal, a story of redemption that struck a chord deep within the Russian leader. "You mentioned sacrifices earlier," the Pope had said quietly, his voice barely audible above the murmurs of the room. "Let me tell you a story about sacrifice. A young boy once gave up everything he owned to help a stranger in need. That boy grew up to become someone who changed the lives of millions, not through power, but through kindness." Putin listened intently, his usual stoic demeanor cracking for the first time. "Who was this boy?" he asked. curiosity evident in his tone. The Pope paused, choosing his words carefully. He was someone like you, Mr. President, someone who could have chosen a path of dominance but instead chose compassion. His name is irrelevant now. What matters is the lesson. Even the strongest among us can be transformed by love. That moment lingered in Putin's mind long after the meeting ended. As he stepped into his waiting car and drove away from the Vatican, his thoughts were consumed by the Pope's words. Could he truly make a difference? Was it possible to lead with both strength and mercy? Meanwhile, back at the Vatican, Pope Francis sat alone in his study, reflecting on the encounter. He knew the road ahead would not be easy. Changing hearts, especially those hardened by years of struggle and power, required patience and perseverance. But he also believed in the possibility of transformation. News of the meeting spread rapidly across the globe. Social media exploded with reactions. Some praised the Pope's courage, others criticized Putin's reluctance to budge. Speculation ran rampant about whether any agreements had been reached. Had the two leaders found common ground, or was this just another symbolic gesture? In truth, neither answer was entirely correct. What emerged from their conversation was something far more profound, a seed of doubt planted in Putin's mind. Doubt about the methods he'd always relied on, doubt about the future he envisioned for his country, and most importantly, doubt about himself. Weeks later, whispers began circulating in diplomatic circles. Rumors suggested that Putin had ordered a review of certain military operations, citing concerns over civilian casualties. Others claimed he had reached out privately to leaders in conflict zones, seeking peaceful resolutions. While nothing official was announced, the signs were there for those willing to see them. And yet, the story was far from over. For every step forward, there were setbacks. Critics accused Putin of weakness, while supporters hailed him as a visionary willing to adapt. Meanwhile, Pope Francis continued his mission, spreading messages of hope and unity wherever he went. One evening, as the sun set over St. Peter's Square, the Pope addressed a gathering of faithful believers. His message that night resonated deeply with those present, and with millions watching online. Change does not happen overnight, he declared, his voice carrying the weight of wisdom. It begins with small acts of courage, with conversations that challenge our beliefs, and with hearts open enough to listen. Today, we witnessed such a conversation. Let us pray that it leads to actions that heal, rather than harm. As the crowd erupted in applause, one thing became clear: the world was watching, and what unfolded next would determine the course of history. But that's a story for another day. Stay tuned for the continuation of this incredible journey, one filled with twists, surprises, and moments that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew. What do you think might happen next? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more gripping stories that keep you hooked till the very end.